The property tax notice arrived addressed to my mother at my apartment. I had set up a mail forward for her accounts 14 months earlier when she had moved in with me, when the diagnosis had made living alone no longer safe. And I almost set it aside without opening it, the way you almost set aside things that look administrative when you are already drowning in things that look administrative. Something made me open it. The notice was a standard annual property tax statement for the house I had grown up in. The house on Birchwood Lane in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the one with the blue shutters and the oak tree in the backyard that I had climbed approximately 4,000 times between the ages of 6 and 14. Except that the name on the notice was not my mother's, and it was not mine. It belonged to a man named Gerald Fowler. I sat at my kitchen table with that piece of paper in my hand, and I read it twice, and then I sat very still for a moment, because I knew that name. My mother had mentioned it. I had filed it away without thinking about it, the way you file away the names of people who exist in the peripheral zone of someone else's life. Gerald Fowler was a man my mother had met at her senior center. A nice man, she had described him. A friend. Someone who drove her to appointments when I couldn't. Someone who had shaken my hand in a parking lot once, briefly, with the particular warm confidence of a person who is very aware of the impression he is making. My name was on the deed to that house, had been on it for 6 years, since my mother had added me as co-owner specifically, so the house would stay in the family if anything ever happened to her. My signature was legally required for any transfer of that property. It had not been obtained. And yet Gerald Fowler's name was on the property tax notice for the house I had grown up in. Before I tell you what the title examiner found when she reviewed the closing documents, and what Gerald Fowler's financial history revealed when the investigation began, tell me, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? I read every single comment, and I want to know. And I want to be clear before we continue. This is a work of fiction, written for entertainment. The names, the people, the events. None of it is real, and any resemblance to anyone living is entirely coincidental. My name is Laura Hendricks. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 19 months, I have been my mother's primary caregiver. A role I accepted without hesitation when the diagnosis came, because she is my mother, because she spent 30 years being present for everything in my life that mattered, and because I had always known, somewhere underneath the ordinary busyness of my adult life, that this day would eventually arrive, and that when it did, I intended to show up for it completely. My mother, Patricia, was 69. The dementia had been diagnosed 19 months earlier. Early to moderate stage at diagnosis, progressing with the particular cruel gradualness of a condition that takes things incrementally, leaving enough of the person you know to make each loss feel specific and permanent. She had moved into my apartment 14 months ago. I had converted my second bedroom, rearranged my schedule, engaged a part-time home health aide for the mornings when I needed to be at work, and reorganized my entire life around a woman who no longer fully understood that I had done so, which was, in its own way, the specific, particular grief of caregiving that no preparation fully addresses. The house on Birchwood Lane, where I had grown up, where my mother had lived for 31 years, had been kept. I had suggested, gently, in the early months of the caregiving arrangement, that we might consider whether to sell it, and my mother had become distressed at the suggestion in a way that made it clear the house represented something specific and essential to her sense of continuity. I had dropped the subject immediately and continued managing the property taxes and utilities remotely out of accounts I handled on her behalf. I had not checked the deed in over a year. Why would I have? My name was on it. It was our house. Nothing was happening to it. Something was happening to it. Gerald Fowler was 63 years old, a retired salesman from Greensboro who had been attending the same senior center as my mother for approximately 12 months. He had been, by every account I was later able to reconstruct from center staff and from my mother's aide, extraordinarily attentive to her, driving her to appointments, accompanying her to center events, calling regularly to check in, bringing small gifts. The aide, A kind woman named Rosa, who had worked with us for 13 months, told me. When I asked her directly after the property tax notice arrived, that she had mentioned Gerald to me once, 5 months earlier, and that I had said something like, "That's nice. I'm glad she has someone to talk to," and moved on. She was right. I had. I had been managing medication schedules and occupational therapy appointments and home modifications, and approximately 300 other things simultaneously, and a friend at the senior center had seemed, in that context, like a straightforwardly good development. Gerald Fowler had apparently spent those 12 months doing considerably more than being a friend. Gerald had taken my mother, on a Tuesday afternoon 2 months earlier, to a notary's office. He had presented documents for her signature. Documents transferring ownership of the house on Birchwood Lane from my mother and me, jointly, to Gerald Fowler. For a stated consideration of $1, which is the legal placeholder used when a transfer is characterized as a gift. My mother, in the middle stage of a progressive cognitive decline, had signed them. The notary had not flagged the absence of my signature. The title company that processed the transfer, a small, independent operation in Winston-Salem that Sandra Perkins' investigation would later establish, had processed several similar transactions involving elderly homeowners in the preceding 2 years, had not flagged it either. My name was on the deed. My signature was required. It was not obtained. The transfer had no legal standing. But without the property tax notice arriving at my apartment addressed to a stranger, I would not have known for potentially years. Sandra Perkins reviewed the deed and the transfer documents within 48 hours of my call and was characteristically direct. "The transfer is void," she said. "Your signature was required and was not obtained." That is not a technicality. It is a fundamental legal defect that makes the entire transaction unenforceable. "We file a quiet title immediately," she paused. "The criminal question is separate," she continued. What Gerald Fowler did, inducing a cognitively impaired elderly woman to sign property transfer documents through a title process that appears to have been selected specifically for its lack of scrutiny, without obtaining the required co-owner's signature. That is elder financial abuse. In North Carolina, it is a criminal charge. I would like your permission to refer this to the district attorney's office simultaneously with the title filing. I gave permission without hesitation. The investigation revealed a pattern that extended considerably beyond my mother. Gerald Fowler had, over the preceding 4 years, cultivated relationships with elderly individuals at 3 different senior centers in the Winston-Salem and Greensboro area. Sandra's investigator identified 6 additional property transfers involving elderly owners with documented cognitive impairments, all processed through the same small title company, all for $1 or minimal stated consideration, all resulting in property titles that had transferred to Gerald Fowler directly or to LLCs he controlled. Total value of properties acquired across the pattern, approximately $1.4 million. My mother's house, the house with the blue shutters and the oak tree, was the most recent acquisition. Gerald Fowler was arrested on 8 counts of elder financial abuse, fraud, and obtaining property by false pretenses. The small title company was separately investigated by the state's Real Estate Regulatory Board and had its license suspended pending a full audit. All 6 of the previously identified property transfers were challenged through the same quiet title process Sandra used for our property. All 6 were reversed. The most complicated cases took approximately 14 months. But every single one succeeded, because the legal defect in each transfer was identical. The exploitation of individuals whose cognitive vulnerability had been deliberately targeted. Gerald Fowler pleaded guilty to 4 of the 8 charges and was sentenced to 7 years in state prison. A sentence the judge specifically noted reflected both the financial scale of the pattern and the particular predatory nature of targeting individuals whose vulnerability was cognitive rather than circumstantial. The house on Birchwood Lane is mine. My name is on the deed, has always been on the deed, and will remain on the deed for as long as I choose. I went back to it the weekend after the quiet title judgment was finalized, for the first time in almost a year. I walked through the rooms with the particular, complicated feeling of someone returning to a place that contains more time than it contains space. 31 years of my mother's life, 22 years of my own childhood, and now this additional layer of something I was still, honestly, working through. The oak tree in the backyard was exactly as I remembered it. Larger, probably. Trees keep going whether you are paying attention or not. I sat under it for a while. I thought about my mother, who no longer remembers the house with the reliability she once did, who sometimes asks me, on good mornings, whether the oak tree is still there. I tell her it is. It is always still there. Do you think Gerald Fowler's 7-year sentence was appropriate? Or should predatory elder financial abuse targeting multiple victims carry a harsher consequence? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, subscribe to the Family Ledger for a brand new story every single day. Hit that bell. You do not want to miss what is coming next.